The topic that brings us together is domestic violence, and I lead an advocacy operation related to boys and men, and I'm interested in all boys and men's issues, and that includes areas where men and boys are causing problems. It also includes areas where men and boys are on the receiving end of mistreatment. Having experienced domestic violence myself from an ex-wife of mine was one of the personal experiences I point to that brought me to this realization that there's a need for advocacy for our male population, partly as a result of how that played out in my own life and some bias that I experienced. So over the 4+ years that I've been doing WIBM, occasionally I'll cover the topic of domestic violence, and connecting with both of you is quite special because you're unique in professional and personal experiences that you had. That uniqueness is related to being men in the field of domestic violence services and prevention and education and awareness. So it's great to be talking with you both. Dorsol, I figured I'd start with you and just ask if you'd share about both your personal and professional experience related to domestic violence, intimate partner violence.
So happy to be here. As you mentioned, my name is Dorsol Plants. I'm a veteran of the U.S. military. I served 5 years, and during most of my time in service, I was in an unhealthy relationship, an unhealthy marriage. A significant amount of that experience was, emotional and psychological abuse, especially because you're not often home when you're in the military. You're deployed or downrange. So a lot of tension, a lot of instability, but even some physical violence, and experiencing firsthand the challenges that can be very unique to a male seeking support and services, especially someone who's in the military and supposed to be tough and, able to defend themselves and, fend off an attacker. But what if the attacker is somebody that you love, and someone that you could never imagine hurting? And so in transitioning out of that work, and wanting to continue public service and moving into serving the unhoused community, you see firsthand just how much domestic violence between partners doesn't just affect the two partners involved, but the children and the other family members involved. And you see so much that while there's a focus in these services on the female identified survivors, oftentimes, especially the young boys who are survivors themselves, are struggling to be seen or be heard in the same way. And so it led me to serving in a role where specifically I was providing emergency shelter to survivors who were fleeing their abusers. And being at the time one of the initially the only male present at the shelter, but eventually bringing someone else on board, you'd see that struggle and that fine line of, there are boys here that need a positive male role model and need support. It can be challenging to navigate violence at home when so much of the male identity in media is associated with violence. Our emergency shelter housing program kind of had two pathways. There was a physical emergency shelter, and that did only serve adult female identified survivors, but would serve male children all the way up to 18, which is unfortunately unique, and something we were proud of. We were able to serve male survivors through hotel voucher programs if we had hotel vouchers available. But those were scattered site remote locations, and it could be oftentimes difficult to provide, I'd say, even with the best of intent, difficult to provide the same quality of service on kind of a hotel stay versus an inside your program stay.
And where was this, and approximately when was this?
Yeah, so it was the Domestic Abuse Women's Network, or Dawn. So here in South King County, and I started there in 2018, and I was there until 2020.
And now you're more in homelessness, housing, and I imagine there's some overlap there because some portion of our unhoused population one of the causes would be violence in the home.
Yes, significant. I believe the statistic is somewhere between 50 to 60% of the unhoused have some form of domestic violence or intimate partner violence that's led to their unhoused situation. And it can be difficult oftentimes, for them to access traditional unhoused services. So even after my time at Dawn and moving back into a unhoused emergency shelter, being able to have that background and understand that, just because somebody's fleeing someone scary and aggressive does not mean that you should be afraid to provide them essential life-saving shelter services. But you do have to be prepared and think about the safety of who you're serving when you do that.
Do you happen to know to what extent when data are collected via surveys for um, people who are experiencing homelessness, is there any gender bias in how those surveys are carried out? Like, are we getting the same kind of information on male homeless people compared to female homeless people, and to what extent like abuse or intimate partner violence might be a cause of why they're struggling with housing?
I think that's a great question. I think, to a certain extent, a lot of the bias would be the implicit, the unintentional. How often in the surveys are we framing, intimate partner violence specifically around the legal definition of violence, which we tend to see impact the gender divide differently. But I would say to a certain extent, yes, because there's a challenge with unhoused data in that overwhelmingly, statistically speaking, the highest gender of unhoused is male. And so without a clear and deeper understanding of what it means to be male and also a survivor of domestic violence, it can be difficult to kind of parse out the male experience when it comes to that, I would say.
Ward, what has your professional experience working in domestic violence prevention and education consisted of?
I've been in the prevention end of the field for the last 20 years. I started an organization in 2004 with a friend of mine called the Men's Network Against Domestic Violence, with the sole purpose of really engaging other men as leaders in shifting the social norms around domestic violence and violence generally. And then we used um, a curriculum developed by Futures Without Violence called Coaching Boys into Men to really use that athletic venue to engage other men as leaders in that effort. So that was in 2004. Prior to that, I started in 1997 in the field of domestic violence, working with victims in the criminal justice system in the King County Prosecutor's Office as a court-based victims advocate. And that career lasted me through 2003 when I went into more of a human services and prevention planning uh, role.
So your work related to domestic violence goes back to the 90s, you said.
Yes. In fact, really back to like 1986 was when I started in the prosecutor's office as a intern. I was headed towards law school at the time, and was working in that field, but not specifically in domestic violence at that time. Domestic violence was a very big policy issue within the state at that time and within the country at large, starting in like 1984 was when the law was changed in the state of Washington to mandate police officers make a determination of who, uh, if they were at a domestic violence scene, and then and that they had to make an arrest. And then in 1985, that law was modified to some degree to insist that they also determine who the primary aggressor was and then make the arrest of that primary aggressor. Between 84 and 85, we saw um, police departments doing a lot of mutual arrests. So they would just arrest both adults at the scene and book them both into custody. And so that became a legislative priority to make them make a determination of who the primary aggressor is in that relationship or in that instant.
Did you have your own view on whether that was an appropriate change?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the intent of the law clearly was not to punish the targeted person with an arrest, right? Like make make a determination about who is the primary aggressor, not who's used violence, because we know that survivors in domestic violence situations do use violence in certain instances, usually, mostly as a defensive mechanism to try and prevent further harm, more commonly prevent harm of the children. Of course, that it just makes things very complicated. At the time, I was both in favor. I was like believed at that time naively, quite young, obviously, that mandatory arrest was going to be one of our best answers to this social problem. I'll never forget. I was an intern in the office at the time. It was 1984. It was July of 1984, and I can remember seeing a string of police cars going off of the I-5 off ramp to James Street, and I asked one of the attorneys at the time I was working with was why the traffic jam of cop cars? And he said, "Oh, mandatory arrest of domestic violence went into effect last night." And and they just arrested everybody, and so they wouldn't commute or transport both parties in the same squad car, so they had to like put them in separate cars, and there was literally a traffic jam to get into the King County Jail at the time. That was kind of the one of a tipping point of interest for me was like, what's going on here and why is this? And that became a kind of actually my initial venture into this field.
Are there any reflections you can share on how your understanding of and thinking about the social problem of domestic violence has changed, has developed over the 30 years you've been doing this?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think certainly I went from being a major proponent of mandatory arrest to a major opponent of it as a policy. The issue is so complex that to attempt to use such a blunt instrument as the criminal legal system to shift it, I think, and I will say this, not that it's not an important player and role maker in this field, but it can't be the only resource that we turn to. And it has been predominantly the only and leading resource that we use in interrupting and responding to intimate partner violence. And I would say that that has been a lesson learned by both the field of domestic violence service providers and of policymakers generally, is that we have over relied and become overly dependent on the criminal legal system as an effective tool to intervene in domestic violence situations. And it's way too complex, I think, for that. Kind of the way it was prior to 1984 is the standard law enforcement response when they responded to a domestic violence scene was to counsel the parties and leave. Um, and so quite often the response was, I remember hearing from sergeants who said, I just show up and I say, "Hey, come on, Bob, you got to settle down. Let me take you down to the bar. I'll drop you off. You can have a beer and cool your jets and things will be better." Of course, we know that alcohol is not an effective response to somebody who's already agitated. That oftentimes, led to really tragic results. In fact, that one of those tragic results is what started the discussion around mandatory arrest as an appropriate response for law enforcement. And I think a lot of the domestic violence field has become increasingly skeptical of criminal legal interventions, moving toward a belief that the community has a much larger role to play in supporting and intervening in domestic violence situations and preventing them in the first place, trying to take what is patterned behavior, behavior that is oftentimes constructed and utilized in very strategic and tactical ways to bring about dominance and control in the relationship, to try to assess based on one incident how that pattern of behavior is playing out is just very, very challenging. Because we're looking at an individual tree, we're not seeing the growth pattern in the forest as to what is happening and why. And so therefore I think we catch a lot of people because of mandatory arrest. We catch a lot of people in this huge net who may have used violence in their intimate relationship and have done it in a sporadic moment, but who are not engaging in an overall pattern of dominating behavior that has the intention of seeking and gaining power and control in the relationship. Not that it's any more appropriate, but it wasn't the intent of the law to grab everybody who was using inappropriate behaviors in their relationships. It's so nuanced. And this is the other challenge, is that whenever we're making public policy decisions or trying to bring about policy change at the broad societal level, that requires a degree of understanding of, in this case, complex human behaviors that has to be boiled down to a specific lawmaker and a group of lawmakers in their understanding. And then the public that they represent has to understand it on some level. And I think that this is such a complex issue that it's very challenging for the average citizen to really grasp it without doing some fairly in-depth understanding of dynamics. Yeah, so I just think one of the things that I've grown to have more appreciation for is the fact that the more complex an issue is, the more localized the response and solutions need to be. And so communities, like even down to neighborhoods, would be better off in responding in many ways, although lack the resources necessary to do so effectively, but would be better off in handling and supporting individuals and couples that are struggling in their relationships. That would be a much more, I think, effective and practical way to help bolster the systemic response to domestic violence and decrease our over reliance on the criminal legal system. We need to have local understanding of relational accountability that allows us to both support and resource individuals and couples and families, as well as the circle of supports around them, with information and tools and resources, including relationship skill development and supportive help and things like that, that shouldn't have to be criminalized in order to bring those resources to bear for those folks that need it most.
I agree with a lot of what Ward had to say, that it's very complicated. And in particular, as he was talking about the mandatory arrest, I was recalling a situation when I was volunteering with the Seattle Police Department where there had been a situation where a veteran had been sleeping on the couch and his 7-year-old jumped on top of him, which resulted in what could be expected to happen to someone who had just come back from a combat zone, being jumped on in the middle of sleep. And because it was a mandated rest, he struck his child. That is domestic violence. He was arrested, and following up with that family, the wife is, I just want him back. What do I need to get him back? Tell me how to get him back.
So the wife called the police?
I don't recall the initial incident, if it was the wife or if it was the neighbor who overheard. But by the time it had reached my desk, because it was a Monday through Friday internship, and so it happened over the weekend, and I'm calling on Monday. And the only thing that the wife, or in this case, using the language, the survivor is wanting is, tell me how to get my husband back. none of my training is about getting the husband back. None of it is about like explaining this complicated process. It's about here's a divorce lawyer. Here's how to get out of the situation. How do we safety plan? Let me sign you up for an alert so you know the moment he's released. And
Now, in this situation, the child was struck, but the wife was not a victim of violence directly.
yeah. And so you see yourself so easily fall into like that line of thinking. Like it's an emergency situation. I have a limited resource. We need to do something. So who's the good guy and who's the bad? It's that default, like almost primal, like thinking someone's good, someone's bad, help the good person, hurt the bad person. And it's so much more complicated, these dynamics, these relationships, especially since, the legal side is so focused on the law side of domestic violence. And, as Ward alluded to, how many weeks and months of psychological trauma can a human being expected to endure before at some point they're going to lash out and throw a plate against the wall? Or scream and throw something or push someone back. And I'm by no means saying that we want anyone to put hands on anyone, but that is just such a human emotional moment. But it doesn't matter if you've had 4 weeks of psychological torment. If you're the person who put the hands on that person, in the eyes of the law, you are now the abuser. And that narrative follows you to the point that even the services you can access are because, I can't help an abuser and the survivor at the same time. So once you have that abuser label, I can't help you. And the honest truth is 9 times out of 10, at least when I was doing the work, if it was a male voice on the phone, you almost always default to that. Uh, like, is this an abuser? Is this actually someone I can trust to provide resources to? And it's weird even as a male to fall into that place. But again, it's that primal good versus evil, and a good person helps good and hurts evil. And yeah, it's just such a trap.
Using very binary, good, bad, defendant, victim. The entire criminal legal system operates on overly simplistic understandings of those kinds of dynamics, and frankly, even that is like the criminal legal system is challenged to even do the right thing in those overly simplified situations. And so it becomes very difficult, I think, for us to make a determination both of like who's the and I agree with Dorsal. I think this is part of the problem too, is like then we're left with this question of like who deserves or is the worthy recipient of the resources and the help. And frankly, if we were to like look at the need that's in, we would be looking at how do we resource everybody here, especially the person causing harm? How do we make an assessment that makes a determination about what's really going on here? What are the needs that we need to tend to? And then how do we bring resources to that particular individual causing harm, as well as the person that's the target of harm and the children that are exposed to that harm? How do we do that in a way that kind of takes away the whole notion of, okay, this is the person that is warranted to receive assistance versus the person that is warranted to receive accountability. And what follows in our current system is then accountability, punishment follows accountability. Um,
And along with this, Ward, aren't there situations where both parties are causing harm and both parties are receiving harm?
I think I think it would be it's almost impossible to live in a toxic relationship, whether there's physical abuse going on or not, and not assess that harm is being done all the way around, that both parties are participating in harmful, toxic behavior almost by virtue of the fact that it's not like just because. you're not dumping a load of garbage into the water that you're because you're swimming in that water that you're not contributing to the toxicity of it, right? Like we have to look at this as more of an ecology than a like who's good and who's bad, right? I think it's just overly simplistic. And that while there may be somebody who is hell bent on um, gaining and maintaining power and control in that relationship, um, there is no doubt that a person that's surviving in that will use maladaptive and harmful behaviors to survive it too, right? So like even in the most, like classic domestic violence situations, and we know this from, I know this, I spent many years working with, the vast majority of my career has been spent working with survivors. Survivors are the first ones to tell us the kinds of maladaptive, harmful behaviors that they've used. They take on tons of responsibility for any kind of problematic behaviors that they've engaged in, and will say, but and so therefore we all need help. And I couldn't agree with them more, right? Like it's like instead of saying, okay, well, you need this help and you need this punishment because you're accountable for this behavior, is such an overly simplistic binary way of looking at a complex dynamic. And then the costs, the costs of that system just to maintain the system, but then the costs of punishment that, like how we engage in making determinations that this person needs to go to jail or prison, and a lack in any of those facilities for any kind of like skill building, uh, healing opportunities. So many folks that cause harm are they may be engaging in dominating behaviors that are harmful and destructive to themselves and everyone around them. But the cause of that may not be just because they believe that it's their right to have that power and control. Some of them may be living in such a tenuous kind of reality that the notion of not being in control is perceived as a threat, right? Like that's the thing that is going to cause harm to me. I'm thinking particularly of many of the men that I worked with in a research study that I staffed at the University of Washington, where a huge chunk of our respondents were veterans coming out of the theater of war and suffering PTSD and substance abuse concerns, and I think like that one case that Dorsol just mentioned, I can think of like so many men that have like experienced that kind of like I believed that I was in immediate danger, and let alone, the fact that it was a 7-year-old that jumped on him, that has no relevance to somebody who's suffering PTSD, awake or not. So I just think it again, it begs the question, how could we reevaluate the way that we're distributing resources away from a really overly simplistic and not to say we shouldn't resource the criminal legal system in a way that needs to be done effectively and responsibly, but we have every answer through uh, the 80s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s was let's have the cops do it. You know, it is an unrealistic expectation that we would place law enforcement in the position of solving some of those complex social concerns that we have, right? And so I think the answer lies in upstream prevention work, similar to the research that I quoted at UW, where we were openly soliciting self-identified, non-adjudicated abusive men to give us a call to see if we could help them get connected with resources that would help them build skills, heal some of that underlying trauma and torment that was going on with them, seek help for their substance abusing behaviors that would disconnect and take out of the ingredients the recipe for the toxic soup that led to that condition in the first place. If we decided as a society that we really wanted to solve this problem, I think that would be the direction that we begin using, is that we would say, hey, struggling in your relationship, want to find a better way to deal with these problems, give us a call. And
And
then
I think another step forward with that would be, let's say we did have a campaign, give us a call about this, is to make sure that it's not continuing this narrative that I've seen maybe from past decades and continuing till today to some extent, that the people we envision as those who are exhibiting problematic relationship behavior are men, are males. And so, for example, like, an inclusive future, a fully gender inclusive future would be if there are campaigns related to domestic violence, you're showing women as being capable of abuse too.
yeah,
Because there are a range of reasons why I think gender bias in domestic violence is problematic. One of them being that I think we're preventing more women who do have behavioral corrections to make that will improve their lives and their relationships. We're preventing them from being able to recognize that they have work to do on themselves too.
yeah.
Well, if
I would say too that, you know, one of my most common experiences was having women call that line, or while I worked in a domestic violence program, women saying, listen, I bring these kinds of problematic behaviors to the relationship, and I know I need to work on them. But because of the prioritization of resources being like, well, first we got to keep you alive, then we got to keep you housed, and then we have to like help you get back on your feet again. So maybe finding another job and stuff like the resources that are available to the average community-based domestic violence program to get to that like level of like, okay, let's provide you with the skills that you need to get the relationship you want too. By the time you get to that level, like the hierarchy of needs, we've exhausted. I mean, we're doing good to keep people alive and trying to find them housing. And finding them housing now is like, as Dorsal can attest, increasingly challenged.
And you're talking there about what services that a community-based domestic violence services organization can provide. But that's not the only entity or groups of people that are involved in domestic violence related things. You talk about
No,
educational campaigns, and that
right,
would be, if we've got curriculums in schools, if we've got, public awareness campaigns, those can be designed in a way that's not perpetuating the narrative that we only view men as capable of relationship abuse.
right. No, I totally agree. And I think, unfortunately, I think the way that many of us as men have been socialized in our upbringing is that relationships are the domain of women. Let's let's outsource that to them. They'll figure it out, and then that kind of both alleviates us from the responsibility. But I have yet to come across a man in any of my domestic violence intervention groups that I ran for years, or in the research that I did. Very, very few would ever say that they don't want to have a better relationship, equitable, healthy, mutually beneficial, mutually satisfying relationships, right? And yet we just don't prioritize the skill development necessary for us to have those relationships, nor do we normalize that as a normative behavior for all of us, right? Like that we all have to, good relationships don't happen by me rolling out of bed and putting my feet on the ground. I actually have to extend effort and intention and knowledge and skill development, and then implement those skills and practice them, and then be accountable for when I screw up, because I will screw up, and then having a fair amount of grace to grease the skids necessary for us to be able to continue that when we continue to mess up. Those are tall orders, right? And I think that we're still, as a species, we're still evolving to the place where we can actually not only identify those needs, but resource ourselves with the necessary resources to bring those about.
Well, and I think we forget just how new, some of this is. What really actually has helped men in a lot of ways, I think, in the domestic violence field is actually the research being done on the LGBTQ community.
Yep.
And the fact that, that gender binary is impossible to maintain when providing those services. And the things we're finding about serving a population when you can't just shortchange gender and say male equals bad, female equals good,
Yep.
is that there doesn't even actually seem to be like an abuser. What they are finding in queer relationships is that in one relationship, partner A is the abuser, but in 5 years, that same person is now actually the victim of domestic violence in an abusive relationship where they are actually the one doing the work in the relationship. And so that education piece is so crucial because what we're really finding when you stop shortchanging and stop using the binary is that an abusive parent can be a loving partner, or you can be an abusive partner in this relationship, but in your next relationship, you're actually the one being abused. And so that dynamic needs to shift, but it can be a real challenge because most of the people I know who've tried to come up with an in-school curriculum have really come up against a lot of challenges when it comes to the fact that this is so personal. Like you're sending your 15, 16-year-old to health class and they're learning what a healthy relationship is. And then they're coming home and asking questions of their parents about why isn't this fitting the definition? And parents are getting up like, and so I think one of the most crucial elements is that education piece, but it's still like collecting the data and the research and really coming up with what it means to talk to boys about this, what it means to talk to boys and girls together about this, especially reflecting on the fact that no relationship is perfect and that home relationship might need some of the work that they're hearing about in school. It's really challenging to talk about relationship education without then teetowing into parental rights. And
Yeah. I think that ideally what we would be doing is resourcing people. And I love the fact that Dorsal brought up the fact that when we started looking at having to serve people of all genders, regardless of the relationship dynamic. So, but particularly in gay and lesbian relationships, and having to deconstruct gender as an identifying risk factor in who was causing harm, we that really kind of expanded the field's um, competency and efficacy in how we went about serving folks that were uh, experiencing harm, um, having resources taken away from them, being punished, being excluded, to where, when I worked at LifeWire, which is a community-based domestic violence program on the East Side, and because of their very unique and excellent shelter model, which was basically independent apartment dwellings, they were able to serve male survivors and their children very effectively, right? To where at one time, I remember we had like three men and their children living in our shelter for ongoing periods of time. And those folks were very well served, but it was because of that very unique and expensive shelter model.
I would just completely concur with Ward. The LifeWire model is, I think, not just the gold standard for DV services, but literally for serving anyone in an emergency shelter model. Because the reality, the saddest reality for me as someone who's primarily worked in unhoused shelter environments is the majority of people are there because of DV. but because it's a homeless shelter, I'm not providing them DV services. And the only reason they're in a homeless shelter is because there aren't enough DV beds. And so
Yeah.
the more we can create a trauma-informed model that reflects the many traumas that an unhoused person experienced that brought them to that unhoused status, the better all of our programs will be at outcomes. I highly recommend anyone watching this interested in considering an emergency shelter model. The LifeWire is I think amazing.
And can you summarize what is unique about that?
It is individual units, actual physical apartment units. And one of the things that I thought was wonderful about it too is the units aren't like it's not like one building of all like the units are LifeWire. It's individual units scattered amongst an apartment complex. So you don't even know who the other individuals necessarily in the program are. You're blended into the community. You're able to potentially return to a sense of normalcy sooner because, as proud as I am of the work I did at my emergency shelter, like it was very institutional. Like you checked in at the office if you needed laundry detergent, whereas in the LifeWire model, like the laundry's in unit, like just like it is in my apartment at home.
Really, it's not a mystery, right? We're talking about providing people with dignity and autonomy that they need to have as the primary ingredients in their recovery from an abusive situation.
And not replacing the abuser. It sounds small, but a survivor being told they can't use their rice cooker because the shelter doesn't allow that.
Right.
Like that's the same thing that the abuser is doing at home. Nope, you're not allowed to do that. I don't like that. And so like sure it might be because of fire code or this or that, but it's when you are hurting, that one small thing really could be the final straw. And I've literally seen a survivor go back to their car and sleeping in a car.
Yeah, we know that autonomy and personal agency are the number one ingredients for someone to be able to recover from that abusive relationship and have the likelihood of going on to having a healthy, non-toxic, non-abusive relationship. If I, as a shelter manager, are telling you you can't do that here because this communal living situation requires us to try to keep everybody to meet everybody's needs, to meet everybody's basic, the line of that in and of itself then becomes kind of another coercively controlling situation that and then the shelter manager is substituted for the abuser, right? And dictating life limiting rules.
As someone who advocates specifically for men and boys in the public arena, I want to acknowledge it seems like we're making progress in the field of domestic violence in removing the bias that we see males as only capable of being abusers and we see females as only capable of being abused. But I also want to acknowledge I think some bias remains, and I think there are some belief systems or ideologies that prefer to maintain that view. And talking with you, Dorsal, in the past, I think I remember you had an example or two of even in your profession, or I thought maybe there's a court scenario also where you, as a male, experienced bias.
Yeah, so it was a personal experience that I had. So there was a situation in my relationship that my life genuinely felt threatened. And I did the textbook, what does everyone think a victim of DV should do? I told my work. My work helped me, and full shout out, this is the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army helped me fill out a protection order request. My sergeant was completely understanding and supportive, male to male, bro to bro. Um, the male judge, however, denied the protection order because, in his mind, and he said this in the court, I was physically taller and bigger than my partner, my wife. And so, if she were to actually try to hurt me, I could just defend myself and hurt and stop her and hurt her back. I have training. I'm in the army. I know what to do. it is such a failure to understand the reality of that 911 call. If I did defend myself, even justly, and how that would look to anyone responding. But it's also that perpetuation of, the unhealthy image by a male for a male where, we are so innately violent that the idea of being violent against someone I love, like, didn't occur to them. But this is someone I loved. I wanted to spend my life with this person, and even defending yourself, like, it's weird to describe, but you can't bring yourself to that. You don't want to bring yourself to that. But what do you do when if you're doing everything you're supposed to do to get help, and it's not the help that's necessarily available for you because your gender should be the violent one. You should be the aggressive one. And it has gotten better, but it's so hard for it. And so, like, because it's innate. Like you close your eyes, like, what is a domestic violence, what does an abuser look like? Like, even me, even as a male, as a survivor, I'm going to tell you that it's a bald, probably chubby dude and a wife beater with stains all over it. Like, that's the cartoons our kids see.
Well, the hour really flew by. I was
Yeah.
shocked that so much time had passed. I want to ask if there are any anecdotes or points that either of you came prepared to share that we haven't gotten in yet. Maybe starting with you, Ward. There was a thing you mentioned to me yesterday, and I wondered if you wanted to share that about the person who came to your house.
Yeah, I had a guy show up to my house that was working on my travel trailer, and he asked, he was telling me the recommendations for what needed to be done to my trailer, and I was breathing deeply as I was listening to the financial impact of that on my pocket. And he said, "Well, what do you do for a living?" Probably wanting to know, can I afford that bill? And I said, "Oh, I work in violence prevention," which is a typical response for how I try to keep it really high level in how I respond to folks. And he said, "Oh, well, you should talk to my ex-wife." And I was like, "Oh, so I was like, well, interesting. I wonder where this story goes." And it became really clear that he had endured um, years long pattern of psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, and physically abusive behaviors at the hand of his uh, quite clearly mentally disturbed and ill wife, right? Like I think that there were multiple probably psychological diagnoses that I would, based on the behaviors that he was describing, that I would probably be tempted to diagnose her with, right? But it was clear that, and he had wound up with custody of their shared child, and was paying her $500 a month just to stay away from him, basically, and to leave him alone. And of course, that situation, if the genders were reversed, that would be unheard of, right? And by rights, he was the one that should be getting paid child support because he's the primary residential care provider of their child. I think that story plays into a broader like analysis and paradigm that I think we would all benefit from how we, rather than seeing who's worthy of punishment and who's worthy of resources, we would like ask the question, what is it that people need? And that we wouldn't immediately assume that someone is going to be manipulative and coercive, although we know that is common patterns of an abuser, but that we would then like be willing to say, well, why? Why are they incorporating, why are they using abusive and manipulative and coercive behaviors? What's going on there? And how can we resource them to not see that as their only way of survival or existing in the world, right? And I think, especially when it comes to men who are using abusive and harmful behaviors, rather than looking at ways that we could punish them, we would, first of all, provide upstream prevention resources like Dorsol was referring to, not only in our schools, but in our home. Like we would resource parents to be able to say, this is how you, if you want to parent your kids to where they're not going to be using harmful behaviors, these are some tools that you might be able to use that would fit into your religious, personal idea of what it is to be a parent, but that would basically give you the skills to teach your children how to exist well in community with others. As I said before, relationships aren't as easy as rolling out of bed. We have to actually practice a set of skills and personal control and responsibility and mutually beneficial relationships development in order to get those relationships that we want. And I think if we were to be able to equip men that are causing harm with the resources, and rather than seek punishment through accountability first, we would look at relational accountability measures to bring about the resources necessary to that individual to get the relationship that they're after. They're just not using the skills that they need because, in my experience, this is true of both men that are causing harm and then men that are experiencing harm, is that many of them are complex trauma survivors themselves. That many of them grew up in homes where they witnessed abuse. They were subject to abuse themselves. Many of them were subject to sexual abuse as children. And that leads to ongoing patterns of harmful behavior throughout their adult life. We need to quit overly relying on a criminal legal system to deal with these kinds of complex challenges and see it as a health and well-being concern with that needs to be resourced in our communities. And so
That
it's
goes right along with my messaging because I'm always talking about health and well-being of boys and men, and
yeah.
the proposal that a state commission could play a role in facilitating that because we do see a lot of areas where our male population is underperforming, is underachieving on metrics related to health and well-being.
Oh,
So
it's become so obvious, right? An organization called Equimundo recently published a report on the state of American men, and it's shockingly disturbing at how men are doing in terms of their well-being. And I think this is the other thing too, Blair. I think that again, within a world that is so tempted to go to their corners and look at oppositional, like, well, you do all this work for women, you need to do the same thing for men. And it's like in a lot of ways, it's just not that simple. And I think really what we need to be telling policymakers and funders is it is great that you've done all of this resourcing and you've learned all the ways in which women and women's disempowerment through our evolutionary cycle as a country has been harmful to not only women, but to the family at large and to children and to our society. Um, but in the process, we kind of left out like, well, then what do men need, right? What do men need to do well, to thrive, to gain access to the skills necessary to support healthy relationships, to support themselves being healthy individuals, right? They're just these two-dimensional performative creatures that do, go to work and, come home and have a beer and want sex all the time and go to bed. By limiting our understanding of men into that really overly simplified two-dimensional performative standard, we have done a disservice to men in helping them understand themselves as complex humans with all the same ingredients in terms of emotional and spiritual and mental and physical needs. And as a result of that, we've kind of left men to their own devices and which, the media at large and now social media is want to like juice on steroids of like, how can we get this guy to consume more beer? How can we get this guy to consume more football games? How can we get this guy to consume as the answer? Because that's in our best interest. But what's in the best interest of men? And I think that policymakers and funders would do well to hear that like we're all for empowerment and benefiting the beneficial resources necessary for women, but let's not leave the other half of the population out of that dynamic and that mix, because by in so doing, we're actually not serving women and children well, because we all have to live in community together. Whether we're in a heterosexual relationship or not, we're all in community together. And if you're not doing well, my well-being and my ability to thrive is going to be limited by the person at the end of the line. It's in my best interest as a community member that I seek to resource that person at the very end of the line as much as possible. And that what we do is, if we're really claiming to be invested in equity and inclusion, we want to bring everybody into the median, right? At a minimum, like bring them into the median, right? And I think that there's been so much, in some ways, there's some justified concern about over-resourcing of men, because historically men held a lot of the power and still hold a lot of powerful positions. But you can't look at a boardroom or the composition of CEOs in this country and draw conclusions about how power is distributed across the society. And that is not a good assessment or analysis or paradigm as to why we would still believe that it's critical for us to be serving the well-being of everyone, but how we have left men and boys out of that discussion, about how do we resource these folks with getting all of their needs met so that they can have the highest quality of life possible. That's going to benefit all of us, including women.
Awesome. Thanks. Dorsal?
Yeah, just really quickly and kind of tying into what Ward is saying, I think as we're lifting the trap of the gender binary, I think it's incredibly important we don't fall into the other potential binary trap of age. As a service provider, oftentimes I would see, behaviors that a boy of 16-year-old was doing, I could describe openly as this is a trauma response because they are a survivor of domestic violence. But as soon as that 16-year-old hit 18,
Right.
suddenly it's no longer a trauma response. This man is an abuser, and you cannot provide services, survivor services to an abuser. And so I think it's crucial that we recognize that, manhood is, the entire life journey. It's from the moment we are born until the moment we close our eyes for the last time, and to truly care and nurture for the male half of the population, we can't stop at 18. We need to nurture men literally up until the final moment, because we don't see, the female half of the gender cutting off that nurturing at 18 in that same way. We need to wrap ourselves around each other and continue that healthy male nurturing past 18, and not just throw up our hands and say, well, he's a man now, whatever he is he is. It's a journey that we can all take together, and we should take together.
And I would add that if that 16-year-old boy is black or brown, the likelihood that he's going to be institutionalized and punished for that same behavior is just dramatically increased, right? So
Yeah.
like we also need to examine the ways in which we see who's deserving, based on other biases that we bring as a society,
Yeah.
to that mix, which would include a really uh, profound analysis of how race and class play into that.
Thank you both very much. Really appreciate you.